And I think that was a moment that Lou helped me to realise I'm doing this for Jesus and I'm doing this for other people. And that's what I think generates a passion that can help you to be sustained in a ministry position for the rest of your life. Because if you can actually have a clear focus that it's not about just doing something that I want to do, it's actually about what I'm doing for the kingdom of God. That's where the passion for me comes from, I think.
Welcome back to the Shock Absorber podcast. It is fantastic to have you along with us as always, whether you're listening or watching us. Always like to see that the YouTube views have gone up, which is very nice. But we're talking about momentum in ministry as our usual series. And to join me in talking about this series is Tim Beilhartz.
Hello, Joel.
Regular co-host. And my other regular co-host, Stu Crawshaw. Hello.
Hello, Joel.
How are you?
A little sad, but I'm okay.
Yes, and we're going to get on to that while you're a little sad, because we're talking about the role of leadership in terms of identifying and working out how to build momentum in ministry. And that the reason that you are a little bit under the weather or a little bit melancholy is because the Queen has just passed away last night. That's when we've learnt the news. She has been she's the longest reigning monarch in the UK's history, which is very impressive. Quite a serious innings. I'm very impressed with that. But also, you helped me to realise that how much of a strong Christian presence she was in her reign as a monarch. And you actually said, Google some things that she's talked about where she talks about Jesus. And there's a list here of the 10 surprising things the Queen said about Jesus. And I thought, why don't we start with this quote and then you can talk about the Queen, because you know a lot more about her than I, Stu. And this is going to be our kind of cultural artifact / story that we always like to start the podcast with. But here's one that she said in 2002, which I believe is from her Christmas message in 2002. The Queen said, "I know just how much I rely on my faith to guide me through the good times and the bad. Each day is a new beginning. I know that the only way to live my life is to try and do what is right and to take the long view, to give of my best in all that the day brings, and to put my trust in God." Stu, what are your reflections on the Queen and how she was as a Christian leader and really the only monarchist in our lifetimes, because she's there for so long?
Yeah, the only monarch, The Queen has been around for 70 years.
Yeah.
TV reported that she has been on the throne for 70 years and has had 15 prime ministers, which is quite remarkable. I think she's been a really steadying influence and a really stable influence, and there's been quite a lot of turmoil during her reign. It was the end of the British Empire when she first ascended to the throne, and her passion to move forward into a commonwealth of nations where there was a friendship amongst the nations that used to be in the empire, I think was a fascinating and amazing testimony to her leadership ability. As a monarch, she didn't get involved with party politics. She didn't sort of polarise people by giving her opinion on things. And I think that was also really interesting. She had a deep personal faith in Jesus, and I love listening to her Christmas messages each year. I don't know if anybody has seen any of them. It's worth going back over YouTube to have a look, but she drew attention to the real meaning of Christmas every time she did a podcast. And I think to have a head of state who was also a Christian is amazing. To think that our Queen served the King of the universe, which was a big favourite saying of hers, that she served the King, was quite amazing. That she didn't act with impunity. She knew that she had a higher authority who was going to judge her. And so, people could debate, and I'm sure they will. They already have started debating, where she did things well, where she didn't. I really like monarchy. I'm not a Republican. I do appreciate some of our listeners and viewers, and some of you guys might be Republicans, and that's, obviously going to be the case. But what I think is interesting is even many Republicans really respect her for her leadership. So I think, it's really poignant for me to just give a little tribute to her. I know a lot of people are doing that, but she's inspired me, and I feel like her leadership was a real model of leadership. So much so that I'm quite sad, actually. Yeah, really sad about her passing. And I know it sounds strange in a modern world to say it, but I think I really loved our Queen. I love the idea of having a monarch that wasn't elected, because I like the idea of the fact that there was a check on our elected democratic system, that we've got someone who's able to to just bring a bit of stability. She didn't have any desire to interfere with the political process and gain power for herself. I think she said as a young woman that she wanted to serve in that role, and she's promised to do it the whole of her life. And the thing that fascinated me, and which makes me most emotional at the moment actually, is only 2 days ago she was welcoming her 15th Prime Minister, and with her frailty displayed for the whole world to see. She had bruises on her hands and she was very gaunt, but she literally worked up till 2 days before she passed away. And so she literally did exactly what she said she'd do, which is very rare. And she could have retired many times as she got older, but there she was with a big smile on her face, shaking hands with the new Prime Minister like she was 20. And I just looked at that and thought, that is, stoicism and stiff upper lip is kind of looked down on a bit these days, but I thought that was incredibly encouraging and inspiring, that she could be not thinking of herself at the moment where she needed to serve her country by welcoming a new Prime Minister. She's there, not complaining, not being, drawing attention to herself, but with a big smile on her face, serving her country. And I don't know if it's true yet, but someone told me today that the paper said that when the announcement was made that she'd passed away, there was a big crowd formed outside of Buckingham Palace, and apparently they were singing God Save the Queen. And I've got to check out this. We'll probably know by the time the podcast goes out, but apparently a big rainbow went up in the sky and was there at the same time or something like that. I don't know. But
yeah, I've seen that reported.
Good time. It has been. I was just like, that sent a bit of a shiver down my neck. I thought that's quite amazing. And so as I said, I'm pretty sad, but also very thankful to have lived through a very stable era with all the ups and downs that have happened. She's had problems in the family and turmoil there, and also turmoil in the country and around the world, but she has been a presence that many heads of state, many people around the world have respected. And I think there's a fair degree to learn from her leadership, which I suppose future generations of historians will unpack.
I think that was one of the reasons why we thought it'd be worth bringing it up in this podcast, mainly because I'd like to hear your passion about why you enjoyed her leadership so much, but also that it's good to look at. We talked about in the last podcast about stability of leadership. Just before we go back to that, Tim, any reflections on the Queen given her passing recently?
Yeah, I think I'm still kind of processing it. My one thought, I went to bed last night and there were just starting to be reports that she was unwell and that her children and grandchildren were all kind of rushing to Balmoral, and wasn't sure what I'd wake up to this morning news-wise. But I think we talked a couple of seasons ago about how seismic 9/11 was, not only because of the violence of it, but because it shattered the understanding that we had of the political and cultural system that had grown up from and again, it felt like from the coming down of the Berlin Wall through to 9/11, there was just this stability in the Western world that things were only ever going on a trajectory upwards. And 9/11, when the planes flew into the Twin Towers in New York City, and then the other planes in Washington, that it suddenly realising that the world has actually changed, like dramatically changed. And I think I've got a bit of that kind of sense. Even last night, I'm waking up this morning and realising that the Queen had passed away. That, as you said, I mean, she's been on the throne for 70 years, so she's the only monarch that many, many people have ever known in the Commonwealth. And it does kind of feel like there is a seismic change, that it's a momentous change. And given that, King Charles III now is 73, so he's coming to the throne at age 73, likelihood that I will live to see the change of another monarch again. And so, that will be a little less dramatic, I think, in some ways, when that happens. Just her longevity, her stability, and I mean, I think I've become increasingly aware of her faith and the way in which she has used that to be confident in the way that she leads. We talked a lot last season about that idea of being confidently Christian in whichever sphere you find yourself. And she has been increasingly confident in her Christianity. She was quite guarded for a long time, but in the last kind of maybe 20 years, particularly in her Christmas messages, has been a great example of where she's actually just being confidently Christian, declaring that Jesus is her Lord and Saviour. She realises that she is a queen over many religious and faith backgrounds, but she's declared her own faith really confidently, in really calm, with a good posture, but able to say, "This is who I believe in." And as Stu said, we believe that she's now with the King that she served, which is a really beautiful part of this, and what makes the mourning of any Christian. There's the sadness in the mourning, which is right and good and proper, and there's also the hope and the joy of realising that she's with her Lord Saviour. And I think there is an appropriate melancholy in that. So that's kind of where I'm at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's a helpful way to look at it. I mean, I suppose that I think her passing has made me reflect on more about what it means for us as a society. And Stu, you've kind of mentioned like it could be like it's a little bit of an end of an era, just like Tim was talking about with it being 9/11 as a similar thing. I was looked up, she came to power in 1926. I had to check that. So she's certainly seen some stuff. Like she's
born, you mean?
Was it born?
Born
Let me
in
check.
26.
Born in 26. I'm sorry, I was looking at it too quickly. But came to power in 1952. Sorry about that.
Right.
But that, as we said, 70 years, and something that we've talked about on the podcast last week about when we had Karen on, we were talking about Breakout Churches, and one of the things that Thom Rainier talks about in that book of Breakout Churches is that the stability of leadership, and that's why it was a nice kind of segue into this podcast that we're talking about. And I think that it said that in Breakout Churches that 21 years is a really good sign of a church being the leader of serving for 21 years is a good sign of that the church will continue to grow and continue to be on momentum. So, and that would mean that someone who's been in ministry for a particular church in 21 years has seen some stuff. I'm just wondering about you guys have been working in ministry, especially Stu, we're nigh on 30 years of ministry for you.
Yeah, 30.
So there's a lot of stability there at least.
At Soul Revival too.
That's what I mean. And like you've been serving at Soul Revival for 10 years.
As a church.
Since we've been a church. Yeah. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on stability and why do you think it is important in terms of leadership?
Well, back in the 1990s, Louise and I, which I think I've shared on the podcast, my wife and I felt a call to create a bit of stability in a little local church, Guymer Anglican Church, where the youth ministers would come and go with quite a lot of regularity. And I remember feeling that was quite disjointed for my discipleship as a young Christian, and thinking that it might be a fun experiment for us to stick around. And we had a pretty profound conviction to do ministry long term, and so we stayed at Guymer Anglican Church as youth ministers for the next 20 years. But back in the 1990s, when we'd already had that conviction, interesting talking to other youth ministers in association with Sydney Youth Works College, which is our youth ministry training in the diocese.
Tim's wearing the hat.
He's wearing the hat, yeah. Tim is actually also employed in Youth Works. Yeah, so one of the earlier principals of Youth Works College, Graham Stanton, who was the foundation principal, he and I and a couple of friends, we'd get together and talk about how can we assess, the effect of leadership on youth groups. And we just put our heads together and came up with the fact that, wow, it seems like all the youth groups that are growing strongly have had youth ministers for 10 years or more. And we thought, wouldn't it be awesome if we could get more youth ministers to stick around for 10 years? Because there was a lot of youth ministers that just came and went, but the churches in Sydney that had grown the biggest had long-term youth ministers. And so at the time, Guymer Anglican with Soul Revival, Fig Tree Anglican, Janelli, Castle Hill Anglican Church with Tim, Hawkins, St Ives, these bigger youth ministries of over a few hundred people had long-term youth ministers. So we felt pretty convicted to not only stay on in youth ministry long term, but also to see if we get some more people to stay around in the long term. And then this research has come out and sort of backs up what we were thinking intuitively back in the day. And I think there's a lot of reasons why sometimes sticking around for 20 years might not be a good idea too, because if someone gets stale in a position or they're actually not effective in a position, that can also be a problem. But I think it's interesting, that link between long-term, low-key relational discipleship, where committed Christians are being trained to disciple one another and be discipled and be on mission together, actually takes years. And one last thing I'd say on that is there was a great Christian leader in Sydney called Dudley Ford, who said to me once that he thinks that it takes a Christian about 5 years to actually go beyond just pleasantries with another Christian, to actually really dig in and help to bear one another's burdens and help to be accountable with each other and really help each other to fight the fight of faith together. And his fear, again, it was back in the 90s that I talked to Dudley, but Dudley said if you look at the average person in Sydney, this is one particular city, people tend to move every 5 years, but when they move every 5 years, they move churches too. So he was worried about the future of the next generation. If they're very transient and they move church a lot, then they're not really going to have that experience of sticking around for 5 years. So I think the leader sticking around long term gives permission to more leaders to stick around, which gives permission to the young people to actually have continuity of leadership all the way through high school, for example, as a teenager, etc. And when you look at that as a whole church, I think we've seen some of the benefits of that, and we've been able to maintain momentum at Soul Revival, and I think partly because we've had that long-term, low-key relational leadership that's possible with stable ministry like that.
And we have Karen, our training pastor, to credit for having a look at this and what Thom Rainier is talking about. He actually sets up almost what we call a leadership pyramid, where there's actually a few levels of leaders that are building up. And what you're talking about in terms of the 21 years plus, and what you've been doing in ministry is, that's a level 6, like the top level. It's actually called a legacy leader, which is like quite a nice name. I would call you a legacy leader for sure. I was just wondering if you guys can think of any other legacy leaders. We talked about Rick Warren, who retired just recently. Is there any other legacy leaders that you would kind of go, could be in the church or not in the church, but could be someone like, I can see their impact that they're having because they do have a legacy, or they're building a legacy on what they're working on? Do you want to go first, Tim, if you have any ideas?
Yeah, I mean, probably in the church. I think I also mentioned last week, John Piper, I think, would be a good example of someone who was at the same church for a long time, continues to be in that church after retirement with a different role, and just the fruit that came from him in terms of his preaching, his writing, the establishment of, I'm pretty sure they've got their own seminary there as part of that church, so that, training. So they're able to just build, up. And I guess there's the evidence of momentum, right? That they're able to not just be a local church, but to be a flourishing church that has a number of ways in which they can see, the gospel growing. That would be probably one. And the other one, probably in the business world, I guess, Steve Jobs, I suppose, is kind of the iconic legacy leader in terms of the one who not only founded the brand, and then, I don't know all the ins and outs. You guys probably know better than I do, but coming out of the business, being asked to come back and save the business, and then go on right through to when he passed away from pancreatic cancer, I think it was. And so much of the Apple iconography and style and everything that was part of his design and his imagination. And so I think there's a significant legacy there in the way that he was able to lead that. So there are a couple that immediately come to my mind.
Is there any that you kind of look up to, Stu, you know that you were like, I wish I would like as a leader to emulate them? Yeah,
well, I mentioned Tim Hawkins at Castle Hill Anglican Church. He was sort of one of the first long-term youth ministers in Sydney. People like Cameron Hislop at Janelli, who's now in his 50s and still leading head of the ship at Janelli Anglican as a youth leader there. He's tremendous. There's a lot of benefit in that. Some leaders can't stay around or don't stay around, or sometimes are called not to stay around at one place for a long time. But there's a couple that I think have made a big difference.
I think about the only thing that I always think about is like sporting teams that have a legacy.
That's a good point.
The one and there always needs to be an alignment between and this is a kind of different because this is a marriage between sport and business rather than leadership at a church, but there's always needs to be an alignment between like the management of the club or the team, the coaching staff and the players, and that's what leads to dynasties. I mean, one of the examples I think of is the Melbourne Storm in the NRL.
Yeah.
They've had the same coach almost from the very beginning,
Yeah,
Craig
right.
Bellamy. The other one,
Funnily enough, sorry to interrupt, but their chaplain has also been there for 25 years.
really, that's interesting.
Yeah, just as a throwaway.
Oh, shout out to him. What's his name?
Oh, I can't remember his name off the top of my head actually,
That's
but
all right.
I'll look it up later. I should know his name. But he's a great guy. But that's interesting. You should say that. It just twigged. Sorry, I was just. Oh yeah, actually, even the chaplain's been there a long time. So that's a
which shows
legacy
that there's kind of almost the front staff, like the main ones, but even behind the supporting staff, and particularly those that welfare staff to have been the same
That's
for
right.
that time. I think all of that probably adds to that longevity that they've had.
Yeah,
and
good point.
I'm big into the NFL, and one of the most recent example is the New England Patriots, who have won. I hope I get this right. They won 6 Super Bowls in the 2000s, and even up into 2000. What was the last one? 2019. 2019, yeah. But that's because they've had the same owner, same coach, and same quarterback.
There you go.
In
Same
Tom Brady.
quarterback.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
right.
Tom Brady's been the quarterback who won 6 titles with them. He's actually gone to 10, which is crazy. He's still lost 2 with them as well. Plus, he also won one with Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But I'm just wondering, if we have that kind of stability, how do we maintain that stability within our church leadership in order to hopefully see that breakout moment continuing the momentum that we're trying to see? Because we talked even last episode, Tim, that there are sometimes, even perhaps within the Anglican system, that people are encouraged to move around from their back to leadership positions, and probably doesn't build that long-term leadership without kind of giving the system a hard time. What do you think that we might be able to change to allow that stability to continue?
Well, I mean, to give it the best possible version, I think that what has been created, both formally and informally as well, I think is what Stu mentioned earlier, that sometimes if someone's in the same role for a long time, it can actually breed staleness rather than longevity, like all the momentum stuff that we're trying to talk about. And so that is often what those kind of systems, generally speaking, are trying to prevent against. I mean, I've got no insight particularly to the rationale of the diocese and why it has that. But that has been, to do 12 years is kind of a really good innings. And usually at that point it's then the encouragement to, okay, what's the next adventure? Where's the next place where you can use your gifts and skills to serve Jesus? Where's the next community? And so, that is just the culture. I know, Stu, you've seen a bit more ministry than I have, and particularly with senior ministers. Have you got any reflections on that kind of?
Yeah, I mean, you get more experience if you move around to different places. You learn from different people, minister to different people. So there's good things about it. But I've always tried to be staying in long-term parish and then be very networked with other people, so that I've been seeking out mentors from other areas and learning things from different disciplines, and being a church leader that networks with other church leaders and gets our congregations to network. So I think that's been beneficial for me over time. Another thing that's beneficial for me is that my experience of working with Aboriginal communities is becoming friends with Aboriginal pastors takes decades. So the fact that I've been in friendship with some of my Aboriginal friends for 2 decades is why we're friends. So in other cultures other than an Anglo culture, it can be actually time is needed to create those relationships. But I think also looking at the Sydney Diocese and other denominations have similar models where they move people around. I think if you come back to your pyramid and you go down to the beginning level of leadership, I think someone who moves around a bit at the beginning could actually seek to be more stable over time. I think that might be a way the system at the Sydney Diocese works at its best. So someone's called a leader, they go into ministry, contributing leader. Even before they become outwardly focused, they're actually starting to just learn heaps of stuff in the first couple of levels. And when they start becoming outwardly focused and then move into that next tier of being a passionate leader, I think that's where, it'd be really good if we could capture long-term leadership at around that that point where someone's becoming passionate about something, and then they really, because I mean, for me, my passion led me to do what I did. I was not just sitting there going, I can't think of anything better to do. I felt incredibly passionate about staying where I was. So I think engaging a leader at that passion moment is very awesome and very important for a denomination. And yeah, I don't know if we talk about that enough, actually.
Is that kind of the pattern that perhaps both you guys felt, that like you felt called and then you had to try to understand what it was to be a leader in a church and whatever role it was, and then eventually you get to the point where, like we talk about Thom Rainier's pyramid, is saying the passionate leader, as you said, Stu, then becomes the bold leader and then leads to a legacy leader. So that is that perhaps the way that we could look at it, that we should be maybe... my question is that what would your experience reflect that? Is my question, I suppose.
Yeah. My experience was I was literally called to be a leader. So I was one of the only young adults left at Guymer Anglican Church, and they were looking for someone to be a youth leader, and there wasn't hardly anybody else left. And I remember getting feedback from one of my friends that when one of our assistant pastors was moving on, she said, "Who are we going to appoint as the next youth leader?" And she apparently mentioned me, and the assistant pastor said, "Oh, don't give Stuart the leadership role. He doesn't know what he's doing." And I don't think that wasn't a massive sledge on me or negative. I don't think I did know what I was doing. I was just like, I was only 19. But yeah, I got called to be a youth leader, and then it was a few years after doing youth leadership for a couple of years that our senior minister actually asked me 6 times to be the youth minister before I said yes, because I don't know if I can do it. So I was literally called in the sense that I was tapped on the shoulder and asked to do it.
That's a number of times.
Yeah. And it was at that point I started contributing and actually feeling super excited that I could offer a few things. And that then led me to I think the beginning of the outward focused leader is actually not just thinking of yourself. That, in the early days I'm thinking, can I be a leader? Do I want to be a leader? Is this what I want to do with my life? But once you become outward focused, you see the reason for wanting to do it is a lot more exciting than even, am I the right person for it? Trusting my leadership, I accepted the job eventually. And I remember, I think I've said this on the podcast before, I remember talking to my wife, Lou, who we just got married. And I said, Lindsay, our senior minister, his name was Lindsay. I said, Lindsay's asked me to be the youth minister again. It's like 6th time he's asked me. And Lou goes, well, why don't you want to do it? And I said, well, I was doing a PhD at the time and I was going to become an academic, and that was what I thought my career was going to be. But then also I said to Lou, I can't play guitar. I can't sing in front of a group of people. I'm not a very good speaker, and I don't know anything about organisation. Like, I'm a terrible organised person. I find trouble organising myself. So I don't know what I could offer. And then I remember Lou said, but you can love people. And I said, yeah, that's it actually. Yeah, I can love people. So I rang Lindsay the next day and I said, I'll take the job. And I think what I've got to offer is I'm really keen to love people. And I really love Jesus heaps, and I really want to love other people. And I think that was a moment that Lou helped me to realise I'm doing this for Jesus and I'm doing this for other people. And that's what I think generates a passion that can help you to be sustained in a ministry position for the rest of your life. Because if you can actually have a clear focus that it's not about just doing something that I want to do, it's actually about what I'm doing for the kingdom of God. That's where the passion for me comes from, I think.
One of the legacy leader characteristics is show unconditional love for the people they serve.
Oh,
so
is
just,
it?
Just as an encouragement, bro. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm always unconditional, but I find it hard to love Manly supporters.
Okay.
That's a big shout out to Cameron Hislop, who I've already praised, but he's also a Manly supporter.
He's a Manly supporter.
He is, I know. We banter about that quite a lot. If you're not sure who Manly is, don't worry about it. It's just a rugby league team. That's not the one I follow.
It's the club that people love to hate.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, but funnily enough, actually, my PT goes for Manly as well. So
does he?
I think I'm
You're surrounded by eagles.
I'm starting to learn.
God's helping you love people.
Yeah, I'm loving them. I'm starting to love them. Probably one of my best mates in the chaplaincy is a Manly person too. So there you go.
Wow, surrounded by sea eagles.
How the gospel can change your heart.
Anyway, unconditional. Tim, I was just going to ask you your experiences of ministry and being called to that too. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I've shared a few times on the podcast. There's a number of different ways in which I was called into ministry. In terms of church ministry, as I've shared before, it was just what you did when you were in year 9 and you were still hanging out at church. You got dropped into ministry because they didn't know what else to do with you. So it's not a great recruitment strategy, but it did get me into children's ministry pretty early, and learned to love it through there. And then in terms of, so I guess that was kind of an accidental falling into ministry. But the more particular calling was the school teacher who asked me to go and help shape the lunchtime group at my school. And I was reluctant to go to start with because it was terrible and dull, and I was far too cool for it, at least in my own brain. And so when...
Did you think that?
Oh, absolutely.
You're such a humble dude.
Oh, it was, yeah.
That surprises me.
Glad I could surprise you.
Just imagine young Tim Billhouse saying, yeah, I'm too cool for you.
Way too cool for that.
But it was by going and this teacher encouraging me to make it better, and then he was coaching me through how to write talks and those kind of things. And then I remember being at youth group and having a lot of talks with you, Stu, about how you were doing chip lunch, and going, okay, well, how can I get the essence of chip lunch into this group at Shire Christian School? And there was lots of things we changed based on the way that you were coaching me on how to do effective school ministry. And so I think all of that combined gave me a real passion for leadership and for ministry. And so I'm not quite sure how strict Rainier is on these different categories, but I guess somewhere in there I was doing level 1 called leadership and level 2 contributing leadership at the same time. Like by giving it a go, I was actually discovering my desire for it, and realising that there was a call, and verbally from those leaders who were encouraging me, and then also you learn to hear the spiritual call of God impressing on your heart, this is where I want you to be giving your life.
It is interesting how, like, if we're going through the levels, we kind of, what is the impact of like what God's actually doing in our lives too? Like, it's not just, it's easy to look at this and go, oh yes, I was a called leader and then I was a contributing leader, but like God is actually
walk home one day, hello everyone, yes. I've just realised I've gone from stage 1 to stage 2.
Yes, I've leveled up. But isn't it interesting that God is actually leveling us up with like the people that coach us, or the people that like speak into our lives? And that was the other thing that we talked about on the last podcast too, is about how breakout churches often have a leader that stays there for a long time, but there's a generous amount of self-reflection, using that idea of Rick Warren's church, Saddleback, where they took a survey of almost their entire church congregations, and they had a number of different places that the church was situated at around California, but they found that there was quite a low level of spiritual maturity, and obviously they did that, and then we think that they implemented ways to try and improve that. I was just wondering, in terms of, I haven't asked you this question, Stu, because you weren't able to make the last podcast, but what does self-reflection mean to you when you're a leader? I mean, again, we've said that you've done ministry for 30 years now. How is self-reflection really helped you continue to move forward in your leadership?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, we'll probably put in the show notes a link to this triangle, so
we'll get Dave to even put it up there.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
The video,
for the video version. Yeah, but even in the show notes for the podcast, it's very helpful actually, because I think what Rainier's identified is that leaders who grow through experience and self-reflection, you do go through stages like you're saying. There's a sense that you need, I think it's great when Francis Schaeffer says that if a leader is invited into a position, that's really helpful, because a humble leader kind of waits to be invited. But, there's a balance to that too, because it's good to see an opportunity and try and get something going. But to actually be called and then to have a fairly firm, some Christians argue that, there's no particular calling, that you just serve Jesus and find out where you're serving him, and you're serving him well wherever it is. But my experience has been a bit different to that. I felt very called to minister at Guymer Anglican. I felt very called to minister within Soul Revival, and that has been very helpful to me when I go through hard times, because I feel like I am able to sometimes find the space to think, am I right for this role? Should I really be doing it? where are my strengths and where are my weaknesses. But at the same time, I'm happy to be able to go through that because I felt called to do it. But there have been times in my ministry where I've needed to reflect on, is this the end of this time here? And there will be a time where I'll come to an end of my ministry at Soul Revival. And coming back to the Queen, she's incredibly inspiring to me because she had a call on her life because she felt called to be the Queen. And she said, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to try and do it as well as I can, and I'm going to do it for you, and I'm going to learn how to do it over the years, and I'm going to do it until I die. And like I said earlier in the podcast, she was welcoming her last Prime Minister, her 15th Prime Minister, and then 2 days later she passed away. And so she served right up until the end. And I love it in Paul's writing where he says, I want to finish the race. I want to run a good race right to the end. So if you're a leader and you find yourself in leadership, part of being a good leader or an athlete or a Queen of England is to be just reflecting on where you're at and having the ending in mind, not necessarily in the position you're in, but wanting to serve Jesus for the whole of your life. That's where the passion comes from. And the boldness in stepping forward and doing new things comes from a sense of security from the call that you started with. And if you feel called to it, and you're contributing and you can see there's something you can contribute, you reflect on that. You reflect on, am I always seeking to be outward focused? How is my passion going? Am I still passionate about being a partner with Jesus as he builds his church? You end up making bold decisions that aren't actually going to be at other people's expense. You're going to, in a sense, seek to do that. And I think making bold moves is what creates legacy, because I think sometimes it's exciting when a group of people feel like they're part of something that's bigger than themselves and they're actually contributing in a meaningful way to that. And the leader is just another one of those people that are in that. So yeah, that's sort of how I feel about it.
Because I feel like we're perhaps, if we're looking at this model, we're trying to encourage leaders to keep working towards being a legacy leader. And some of the characteristics we've already talked about, but I thought it worth reiterating them just so we know what we're talking about. And there is one that I really want. I'll leave that till last that I'd like to ask you guys about. But have long-term ministries, average exceeding 21 years. We said that before. A humble confidence and attribute success to God, not themselves. Accept responsibility for the outcomes. Show unconditional love for the people they serve, which we talked about before. Persistence, and don't consider a setback a failure, and passionate about reaching the lost. And the last one that I wanted to talk about, though, and it harks back to our previous season on evangelism, was evangelicals with a high view of Scripture. And I was actually really surprised at that. It's interesting. That's
really important.
But it is really important, as you're saying. Tim, what do you think in terms of, like, we talked about how important it is to be evangelical, holding the evangelical line, and it seems like that's borne out in Thom Rainier's research as well. So what are your reflections on that, and why do you think that Rainier found that so important as a legacy leader?
Yeah, well, I don't know Rainier's methodology, but I take it that he's, my understanding from what Karen said last week is that he's looking at what has been legacy leaders and what are their characteristics. So he's looking at those who have succeeded and what are the characteristics that they have in common, I think, is his methodology there. And so the fact that he found that the legacy leaders are evangelicals with a high view of Scripture, what that says to me is that it works. The truth works, which is what we would expect in God's created order, that the teaching, preaching, leadership that aligns with his order, where his word and his world are working together. And so we see that cohesion between a clear gospel presentation which communicates the clear truth of who Jesus is, what he has done for us on the cross, the life that we can have in him, the life we're called to live now and live forever with him in new creation. That message is, you can notice that message is characteristic of those who have these legacy ministries, I think is really significant. And for me, it's just an extra piece of evidence that shows the truthfulness of that message, that it really is the message that coheres with who we are. It speaks to the deep heart of people, potentially their felt needs, but even deeper than that, their truest, deepest need. And that when people do submit to Jesus as Lord and King, that that does affect change in their life, in their family's life, their community life, in their church life. So, I'm always really encouraged when I see research like this and statistics like this that uphold the truthfulness of the gospel, because if it is good, true, and beautiful, it is what God has actually built into the world. And so, if evangelical Christianity is true, then it should also function well. It should work, and we should be able to see it working. And I think that's kind of what Rainier has noticed here, which is really encouraging.
Sure. Any reflections on that?
I think it's really good way to come to an end, like you said, of the podcast, because again, coming full circle, talking about Queen Elizabeth, her impulse to be a part of a government in her time that actually gave back territories to that England had taken into the empire, to actually look. It wasn't completely perfect, and there was lots of problems with what took place as the empire collapsed. But to think of the Queen as the leader of a declining empire whose impulse was to form a commonwealth, I think even that one thing was quite amazing, that India was a colony of England for 200 years, and then under the Queen's reign, her idea was, well, let's be friends. And also the impulse of the government at the time to say to people from the empire who wanted to stay British that they could move to England and move to the UK if that's what they wanted to do, was again, where did those impulses come from? And there's probably lots of facets to that, but I think the gospel-heartedness of a queen who knows she's responsible to a higher authority to seek to make the world a better place in her way and in her time is she said it again more clearly in her Christmas speeches recently, that it's her that Jesus is her model, that he was her inspiration. And so I think, I don't know, again, historians can argue one way or the other how important that is. I might be right off beam there, but I think you can see practical outworkings of her legacy, that if the future king doesn't continue on in that way, I think it'd be interesting to see what happens in the future. I mean, King Charles has already just ascended to the throne. He has, I don't know what his particular opinion is now, but I have heard in the past that he was not planning on being the defender of the faith. He was planning on being the defender of the faiths. Queen Elizabeth said her faith meant that she was taught to love all faiths and be the queen of everyone and accept and love everyone. But his view of being accepting and loving everyone is to defend all faiths. I think that's going to be a very different impulse. And so coming back to that call, what is the call? Well, the call on a Christian is to partner with Jesus as he grows his church. It doesn't sound like the new king is going to have that same. He may, I don't know, I've got no idea. But I think the Queen has been explicit in seeking, in her way, with her worldview, in her time, in her generation, in her, you could talk about all the power and the money she has and all that kind of stuff and argue with everything I've said, but in her world she's been guided by something. And I think what I've thought as a leader is we've got to be very careful we never get to a point where we think we are the person who sets the vision for the group we're leading, but we're actually accepting the vision of the Lord, and we're trying in our generation, in our way, with our skills to actually implement that.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way to end. I was just looking at another quote here from Queen Elizabeth from 1981, where she says, "Christ not only revealed to us the truth in his teachings, he lived by what he believed and gave us the strength to try and do the same. And finally, on the cross, he showed the supreme example of physical and moral courage." So hopefully that's an encouragement to anyone that's listening as leaders, that if they are finding things a bit tough, I think that's really cool. And I think it's been really cool to reflect on Queen Elizabeth's reign, and also just how as a model of leadership for us. So thank you also for your guys' leadership as well. So I appreciate it, and I think that's a good way to wrap up the podcast. Just before we do though, I should let you know, if you are listening or you're watching, that the Shock Absorber Conference is coming up on the 29th of October. We'd love to have you along so we can continue to discuss many things, including the Queen, if you want to.
Just do a breakout session, I'll lead that one.
Yeah, that's right. Well, then you're leading a lot of breakout sessions then if you do that. You can check that out on the shockabsorber.com.au website, where you can register for the conference and pay for the $10 that we have, just asking you to cover the cost of lunch. So that would be awesome to have you along. We can continue the conversation via email as well. You can email me at joel@shockabsorber.com.au, or you can get on the Discord server, subscribe if you haven't already subscribed, whether it's on YouTube or your podcast app. And once again, thank you very much to my regular co-hosts, Tim and Stu.
Thank you, Joel.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much. And we finish with a one way.
One way. God save the Queen.